Would you say that the European Union, having in mind that it is propagating a soft power, is using enough of soft power in order to make such countries like Belarus closer to Europe? Do you think that Europe is doing enough on human rights, especially?
Well, I would say that human rights. This area seems to have become central part of European political identity, and I think that in fact this soft power and human rights, particularly our attempt to mainstream human rights, so it could be described, as the very heart of European politics. Of course, always it's possible to add something to what's happening in the European Parliament, and I think that many things could have been done better. When it comes to Belarus or countries that remain deeply problematic from the point of view of human rights and their violations, well, I think that, in politics we rely on the, I would say on the stick and carrots approach. The stick and carrots. But keeping in mind that soft power remains a very important tool, and I would say the nexus of European politics, I would say that we rely on carrots. We try to please politicians, we try to get them engaged, we try to get them involved. But not always seems this possible. For instance, with Lukashenko, I think that carrots, stick and carrots were changed many times, trying to apply one aspect or another of this policy. But I think that in many ways dictators happen to be quite manipulative, quite guileful, quite intelligent, and they may turn down the entire discourse of human rights propagated by the European Union. I think what is very important is to keep in mind that human rights violations, for instance, very severe, very brutal human rights violations like in China, Russia or Belarus, don't tell us anything about something backward or something, something old-fashioned about those countries. For instance, China or Russia are very modern countries. Russia and China are powerful, modern countries with their emerging economic power. But the problem is that they fundamentally deny the whole concept of human rights. And that's why European politics, and in the EU especially, has to do really much trying to convince the political class, the political elite of those countries, that Europe is not going to change its policy, that human rights are the very heart, the very nexus of our politics, and this is not for the moment, so to say. It will stay. And this is very important, and of course it could be done better, it could be done even more. What remains, I think, an effort for the future, I would say that our work with NGOs, our work with Belarusian NGOs, I don't think that we are awfully efficient in terms of our possibilities working with the Belarusian society. Yes, we take on board many good people, Belarusian dissidents, but again, dissidents are quite divided. They're quite divided in Belarus, it's a public secret, so to say. But we haven't done enough to exploit the possibilities and to capitalize on, for instance, the Europe Humanities University, a university in exile, which is in Vilnius, which is based in Vilnius, and I think that we should have much more students. We should have much more in terms of some segments of student body, of professors, dissenting intellectuals, NGOs, and the same applies to any other Eastern Partnership country. I think that much remains to be done in terms of our work with NGOs. We rely on diplomats, sometimes we rely on politicians, we try to work with the political elites. Not always does this work. And that's why I think we have to be more flexible. Human rights appears as an area where intellectual sophistication goes hand in hand with the political principle, with the value and idea system, and that's why we have to do much, much more. Of course, self-flagellation is not exactly what I'm going to do now. I think that Europe deserves credit for many things it has done. Europe deserves credit for its policies and for its consistency, for its dedication to soft power. But again, democracy is about stating someone's inefficiency or someone's shortcoming, so to say. That's the only type of regime, the only type of political regime which openly, overtly states that nobody is perfect and nothing is perfect in the democratic rule, and the same applies to human rights. there cannot be any kind of perfectibility or any kind of perfection achieved in this field. It's always the struggle, every day. So that's why we have to do many things better. And I would imagine that, I would say, our cooperation with national parliaments, with NGOs all over Europe, so trying to involve, for instance, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Baltic intellectuals, Baltic NGOs, students, this is something very important, because I think that Europe is about exactly what I would describe as the possibility to enrich one another, to go hand in hand, trying to bring someone's perspective. We have a very special perspective for Eastern Partnership due to our past, due to our experience. But for instance, we have to consult France or Luxembourg or Belgium when it comes to Africa. When it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, of course, we don't have much experience, and this is our weaker side. When it comes to Central Asia or Moldova or Ukraine, voila, Lithuania is quite strong. We have much to say. When it comes to Africa, when it comes to some other third countries, we have to consult our friends in Western Europe. That's why it's a very meaningful and always important attempt to go hand in hand, to consult one another. And human rights is exactly that kind of field, that kind of political field, where cooperation, intelligence, dedication, organization is something that we need the most. I would say that Michael Ignatieff, a Canadian human rights defender and politician, the former head of Canadian Liberals, expressed this in the best way by saying that human rights seems a field where Western organization and efficiency on the one side and the courage of Chinese and Russian dissidents played the most important role. I still believe that we have much to say, and I think that the profile of Lithuania could be even higher in the human rights area, and the same applies to Europe on a whole. I believe that it's very important precisely because we are in such a phase of world history, in such a phase of international relations, that we have to tackle many challenges, many global challenges, and many states are put into question. Many states find themselves simply unable to cope with that. And this is why it is so important to defend human dignity and human rights, because out of this confusion, out of this total global chaos and confusion, I'm just afraid that some states may panic and may lose moral compass. And that's why the EU has a unique chance, a unique profile to pursue this policy.
Talking about EU's role and Lithuania's role in spreading the democracy in our eastern neighbors. Lithuania invested quite a lot of its political capital to Ukraine in order to spread some, or to help Ukraine to come closer to the Western values, Western structures. And we have a result that, shall we call that the last election? So the last actions in Ukraine shows that it is actually a little bit returning back from a democracy. Nevertheless, some liberals in Ukraine saying that the European Union is applying double standards. It's having very, very good cooperation with some northern African countries, even though until quite recently they were quite harsh dictatorships. But when it comes to Ukraine, even if Ukraine is not that perfect democracy, European Union is actually asking for more and more from Ukraine.
Yep.
Do you think that because European Union has more faith in Ukraine and more standards than to those countries in Northern Africa?
It's a very good question. I could say that, we could analyze case by case many tensions and frictions between the EU and Ukraine in terms of some clashes, some opinion clashes between Ukrainian and European politicians. I think that a case-by-case approach would be helpful because it's very difficult to generalize. On the one side, it could be exactly the way you describe the situation, precisely because we think very highly of Ukraine, precisely because we know that it's a European nation with a wonderful cultural tradition, with a very rich history and almost civilizational role played by Kiev, Rus, Kiev, Russia, the ancient classical Russia, so to say, and then modern Ukrainian culture. Precisely because of this, it will happen that sometimes Europeans exaggerate the role and possibilities of Ukrainian politicians, forgetting about how young and fragile Ukrainian democracy is and how young the Ukrainian political class happens to be. So, on the other side, it could be what you suggested, that precisely because Ukraine is a more remote country, it's not that part of West European experience. It's not that part of experience that could be measured or put into the context of historical, cultural area of European value and idea system. It could be precisely because of that Ukraine is perceived, well, as a country which is not a European necessity, so to say. So I remember this phrase because it sounds very cruel, incredibly it sounds, but this phrase was offered by one British diplomat, and it was offered about the Baltic states before the Second World War. In interwar Europe, so one British diplomat described the Baltic states as something that was not a European necessity. Now it sounds very strange because we know that it is a European necessity. But again, if some colleagues think that Ukraine is not a necessity, it could be very good to have it, but if it's not going to happen, so what can you do about it? It could be a very regrettable approach because Ukraine is simply too complex to be measured like that. On the one side, it's a very important country because there is more democracy and pluralism in Ukraine than in Russia, for instance. Russia is pivotally important, of course, but again, we shouldn't deceive ourselves. Putin's Russia cannot be compared to Ukraine. Ukraine, no matter how many imperfections Ukraine has in terms of corruption, in terms of lack of transparency, but Ukraine has viable and valid democratic institutions. And Ukraine has much more pluralism. There is no censorship in Ukraine. Yes, there are some violations of some standards of democracy, we know it. There are some violations, there are some cases of selective justice, like in the case of Tymoshenko. Those things are quite bad. But at the same time, I think that Ukraine, especially Ukrainian intellectuals, Ukrainian magazines, the public domain, the public sphere, did many wonderful things, setting a very important lesson for other Eastern Partnership countries. Again, it would be quite naive to compare Ukraine to Azerbaijan, for instance. It's obvious that Ukraine does care about human rights. Azerbaijan does not. As simple as that. It's a very important country, and we respect Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan doesn't appear to me as a country which follows with almost religious fervor every bit of European policies regarding human rights. Not now. Not so far, so I have to say. So we have to distinguish between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Azerbaijan and Ukraine. For instance, no matter how much corruption is in Moldova or Ukraine, but those countries don't have censorship. Pluralism is much stronger in Ukraine or Moldova than, for instance, in Azerbaijan. To say nothing of Kazakhstan, where the human rights situation, much to my regret, is deteriorating all the time. So at this point, we should have the lighthouse. We should have something that could be regarded as a standard bearer. And Ukraine could be regarded as a standard bearer within the framework of the Eastern Partnership. It's a stronger partner, more reliable partner than for instance, some countries of South Caucasus. So I would say that it would be profoundly unwise. It would be profoundly unwise to dismiss Ukraine, or to start finding ourselves disappointed with Ukraine. Ukraine is too large, too complex to be regarded like that. Yanukovych is not Ukraine. If we don't like president of Ukraine, we have to remember that Ukraine is made up by many segments of political life, many parties, many players, and there are some segments of societal life. And since I'm quite close to Ukraine in terms of my cultural and intellectual exchanges with the country, I have to witness how rich and diverse Ukrainian life is from within. So I think that, again, this is our role. Lithuania could be instrumental in bringing a stronger perspective on Ukraine, I would say, updating our colleagues from France, Britain, Germany concerning Ukraine. This is up to us because we know better. We know better what's happening on the ground. We speak the language. We speak Russian. Still, my generation has more expertise, more knowledge when it comes to academic people than West Europeans who don't speak the languages of Eastern Europe, who don't have first-hand knowledge in most cases. So that's why we should try our best. Ukraine is a friend. And I would say that Lithuania couldn't have a better friend than such countries as Ukraine, as the countries of Eastern Partnership. It's very important because we are the countries of the same fate. I would say the same about Russia, but Russia is too complex a phenomenon. But we don't have closer nations than East European nations, which simply had the same purgatory and the same inferno, as the Baltic states did. So I would say that it takes more flexibility, more wisdom, And I would very strongly argue saying that we need more wisdom, more flexibility, more pluralism, and more diversity of opinions when it comes to our evaluation of Ukraine.
And the last question, very short question: Lithuania is considered as mature democracy, shall I say, or democratic country? Maybe not very that with a long tradition. And look at us. We have Paksas case, impeachment of the president. Now we have the elections, which are actually quite scandalous because there's a lot of cases of buying votes and selling votes from. And we have a person who is undergoing the criminal legal case, and he is one of the most popular politicians in Lithuania. Do we have a right to preach other countries as Lithuania for themselves being not that perfect democracy, as we are maybe perfect democracy in the sense that those things will allow to clean it up afterwards to some extent. But the processes which are happening in Lithuania, it doesn't really show that we are that mature as not only political establishment but society itself. Do we have a right to do?
I subscribe to your point of view, and I endorse your skepticism, because in fact I think we don't have a right to preach and lecture countries like Ukraine or other friends like Moldova. It doesn't make any sense because, well, nobody is perfect in this world. Lithuania is a young democracy itself. Yes, of course, things are functioning better in Lithuania than in the Eastern Partnership countries. Lithuania is a stable democracy. But again, on the one side, it depends on how we approach the whole problem. From the point of view of, or from the optimistic point of view, so people would say that, look, we exposed Paksas, we exposed Uspaskich and the Labour Party, so we're the ones who didn't remain silent about that. From the pessimistic point of view, that would be something like, look at our society. They vote for criminals, they vote for people who are just, So it all depends, but again, we have to be courageous enough to admit that, well, this is what democracy is all about. Democracy exposes societal weaknesses. Democracy, better than any other method of governance, exposes the weaknesses and sometimes even the dark side of societal life. So, and we have to be thankful for our ability to stick to these rules. So we know what's happening in the country, otherwise many things would have been hidden from our side. But at the same time, I fully agree with you. It would be quite naive, even foolish, to come up with a sort of, messianic approach, offering it to our friends in Ukraine, Moldova, or Armenia, or Azerbaijan, saying that, look, we are, the ones who will blaze the trail, for you to democracy. No, that would be quite silly. We have to be consistent, we have to be benevolent, we have to do our best, but we have to be modest. We have to come up with with an assessment like that, well, we are not perfect ourselves, we have many problems. But at the same time, since we know what happens when you have, a very, very short history of democracy, we could be very good advisors and very good partners precisely because we know what can happen. And we experienced many things like that. On the other side, I would say that Lithuania is credible. It's credible in the eyes of many East European countries, precisely because Lithuania never tried to show itself, as a sort of, as a perfect country. So Lithuania seems to have never been arrogant, looking down upon some other countries of Eastern Europe, and this is a good thing. We have to be modest. We have to be realistic. We shouldn't lose the sense of reality and the grounds. And I would say that it's a very good thing sometimes to organize very honest political and intellectual debates, clearly saying that, look at us, nobody's perfect, so that's why don't be too pessimistic about your situation. This is what I try to say to my Armenian or Ukrainian friends when they sound, like it's sort of, apocalyptic scenario and the world is, falling apart. So I say that, look at us. You regard Lithuania as a success story, and quite rightly so. But look at us, so. Look what kind of politicians we have. Look at what kind of scandals we are suffering from. So this is to say that nobody is perfect. You have to be prepared to work very, very hard on this because it takes time. It takes much effort to build a normal and mature political class, something that we have yet to achieve. And I believe that from this point of view, well, democracy teaches much realism. It's very, very good. So I would say that as an educational, pedagogical process, it's quite healthy for both sides.